very much for joining us today for our online talk, The Ice Age Giant Deer Megaloceros. If this is one of your first times joining us for this online event with us here at the museum, we are delighted that you could make it. My name is Geraldine and I work here in the Education Department at the National Museum of Ireland Natural History. We are delighted to be back on site in our offices now that the ground floor of the museum is reopened. Just a reminder, to visit, a booking is currently required, and you can get your free ticket if you visit museum.ie. The upper floors of the museum will remain closed for the foreseeable future, as it's currently a building site facilitating ongoing investigative works into our 165-year-old roof. So keep an eye on our website and social media channels for the most up-to-date information regarding the museum, okay? And don't forget, you can always view the upper floors on the 3D virtual visit on the website. Now, back to why we are here. Today's broadcast is a closed YouTube live event with a pre-recorded talk that will last about 20 minutes, after which we will be back here live for Q&A. The entire event will be posted online at a later stage so that you can rewatch it again or share it with family and friends. This will be up on YouTube, so you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or keep an eye on our social media channels as well to know when it is public. If you would like to ask any questions today, please use the chat feature on YouTube. And please be aware that to post a question, you will need a YouTube account. And we will try and get through as many questions as possible in the 10 minutes we have. Now, for fans of the museum, aka the Dead Zoo, today's speaker really does not need any introduction. However, it is my pleasure to welcome Nigel Monaghan, recently retired keeper of the National Museum of Ireland Natural History. Hi Nigel, how are you doing?
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody who's watching and listening.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you are enjoying your retirement.
It's great. A lot less to do and a lot less to be distracted by, but I will be carrying on doing research and the work that I like doing without all of the extras that you don't all love, but you still have to do when you're in the full-time workplace.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And I think we will just get straight into it because I think we have lots of people watching today and there'll be loads of questions later. So we're now going to play Nigel's pre-recorded talk and we'll see you back here afterwards for the live Q&A. See you soon.
This is the story of the giant ice age deer called Megaloceros. That's its scientific name, but in fact it's a very famous animal in Ireland. It's famous as a fossil. You'll see it in museums, on the walls of stately homes, and even in our street furniture. There's a number of statues, including this one, which is up in County Down. A magnificent animal. You're talking about an animal the size of a horse, with a very big antler span, the biggest antlers that have ever been seen on the planet. And it's a feature of our museum in the National Museum of Ireland that a lot of visitors come to see. It's not a new thing. We've known about giant deer for a very long time. This is an illustration from the 1580s. It's part of a letter that was sent from the Archbishop of Dublin, a major landowner on behalf of the church. And Adam Loftus sent this over to his counterpart in Queen Elizabeth I's government, who had a new stately home and was looking for something to put on the walls. In those days, it was generally referred to as a deer or large horns. It didn't have a scientific name at that point. But because they're so distinctive, they're quite easy to work out separate from other large deer that might have been found buried in the ground in Ireland as fossils. This one is referred to in a 1697 paper, the first scientific paper by a man called Thomas Molyneux, a member of quite a scientific and interesting family. And it refers to a large set of horns that belonged to a Mr. Van de Leur in the county of Clare. And it even refers to the fact they were buried in marl, which is something we'll come back to. They were presented to the landowner, the Duke of Ormond, who had these huge estates that were rented out to tenants. And the Duke of Ormond was the principal character in the British administration in Ireland. This is the Duke of Ormond. and he presented the antlers to his close friend Charles I. Vandeleur's antlers, we know, must have been dug up before 1641, because in 1641, on the right of this slide, we have online testimony recorded at the time by James Vandeleur of County Clare, describing how the local Irish had ruined his crops and driven him from his home. Ireland was quite an unstable place politically at that time. Vandeleur would have been seen as an invader or a settler that wasn't necessarily going to be very welcome in a largely Catholic Ireland that was being steadily settled by loyal Protestants from countries such as the Netherlands. Those antlers were sent over to Charles I, and they were in a large room that was lined with antler and other trophies called the Horn Room at Hampton Court Palace, which is in England, not far from London. They're still there. They're on the wall of a stairwell at this stage, and have been moved out of the Horn Room, but they're in the top right hand of this photograph of the stairwell. And you can see the large flat areas of antler that are very distinctive and a major feature of the giant deer species, Megaloceros giganteus. The Royal Dublin Society was an organization that brought a lot of scientists together throughout the late 18th and early 19th century, and they developed a museum. It's still there today. You can visit the National Museum of Ireland as it now is. It was built in 1856 as the Museum of the Royal Dublin Society, and the intention was that it had a bit of everything that the society owned. It grew and grew to the stage that only the natural history collections really fitted in the building, and that's the way it is today. At the front of the museum, you can see 3 large skeletons, and the one in the distance on the left is a female giant deer, and they're quite notable because they don't have the giant horns on the front end. But if you look at the specimen on the right-hand side, this is one of the oldest fossil giant deer skeletons in the world. It was the first to be described scientifically, so that other people in other parts of the world could see what did the whole skeleton look like. Many had heard of the horns, but they hadn't actually seen even a drawing of the whole animal by the end of the 18th, early 19th century. Those are not the only giant deer that are owned by the National Museum of Ireland. All of this racking system has giant deer antlers on it. There are hundreds of sets overall, and that allows us to have this huge scientific resource, the biggest giant deer collection in the world, that is used by quite a lot of different scientists and has been examined extensively over the last couple of decades using a lot of modern scientific techniques that allows us to find out an awful lot more about giant deer. Up until 150 years ago, people knew they existed, they knew they were extinct, and they knew they were found across the boglands of Ireland in the sediments underneath the peat layers. But they didn't know an awful lot more. And we've been working hard over the last decades with a lot of visiting experts to develop our national and international understanding of these amazing animals. A lot of the giant deer on that shelving system came from one single deposit at Ballybeata Bog, which is in the south end of County Dublin, heading into the Wicklow Hills. And there was an excavation through that bog in the 1840s that uncovered a reindeer antler set, which is magnificent, but also some giant deer scraps of bone. And scientifically, people went back later in the 19th century and excavated this hall here, shown in a museum photograph from our archives, that gives you an indication of how many giant deer you can find in a relatively small space. There's quite a lot of complete heads, there's a lot of isolated bones, including shoulder blades and leg bones, and also some juvenile antlers. But giant deer are not actually found in the bog itself. The bogs of Ireland today are peat deposits that are water saturated, and they sit at the locations of old lake sediments. So you had these depressions and hollows in the landscape at the end of the Ice Age. They infilled with the melting ice deposits, and a lot of that was pulverized limestone, which is why this layers on the right-hand side here are mostly gray. also known as marl. Any limestone, clay, sediment can be referred to as a marl. And above, towards where the person is holding the ranging rod here, you have some darker layers that represent younger layers. There's a very thin band of sediment that represents the period when giant deer were very extensive in Ireland. Below that is the grey clay, and above that is a series of lake sediments leading up to where the person would be standing, which was where a peat bog was until the major road excavation removed it. We know that giant deer are found in that setting a lot because people have been digging down, including Mr. Vandeleur way back in the 17th century, and people in County Meath who found the earliest giant deer in the 1580s. But giant deer bones are found in other Ice Age sediments, and some of the most important come from Irish caves. Caves were discovered by accident to have bones in them in Ireland. It was well known in other countries. From the 1860s onwards, several Irish caves were excavated in detail, and giant deer have been found in the older sediments of nearly every Irish cave around the countryside, where bones have been able to survive in the cave sediment for tens of thousands of years. Those cabinets around the top floor of the Natural History Museum in this dark brown wood are a major treasure trove for us as museum curators and scientists wanting to research giant deer and other Ice Age animals. There are drawers and drawers heading off into the distance. This is one of just 90 cupboards full of animal bone, including in this case giant deer legs and jaws all packed in. And this is the research resource that has been excavated from Irish caves up until about the middle of the 20th century, when most caves were fully explored and most bones had been recovered. And here we have the species laid out animal by animal all around the balcony and labeled in detail that allows us to plot them right back to the original point within each cave system to know where each bone was found and what other animals were found close by. We've used bones from these collections to radiocarbon date a lot of animals, and particularly the giant deer. So we know from some of the older bones in the cave excavations in Ireland that giant deer were living in the landscape around 35 to 40,000 years ago. We also know that the majority of giant deer lived in a much later period, towards the end of the Ice Age. The Ice Age was a series of major climatic events that changed between the sort of climate we have today, or a cooler version, right back to total ice cover. There was a period about 20,000 years ago, for example, when ice would have covered the whole of Ireland, except perhaps for some of our taller mountains that would sit up like these pictures from much higher north in the planet, up in areas like Greenland, where you will see these nunataks, these little bits of mountain fragments sticking up above the ice. But generally the climate is so cold and so severe that there's very little plant life or animal life. And there certainly wasn't the landscape in Ireland 20,000 years ago to support populations of animals like giant deer with their huge nutritional demands, who needed a reasonable climate. They also needed a good supply of very rich vegetation in order to get through their typical life cycle as a large mammal. We think of Ireland very much today as an island, but it wasn't always like that. If you go back to the time when, after 20,000 years ago, when the neighborhood was completely covered in ice, to when the ice started retreating, there was a lot of land exposed because a lot of the sea levels of the world had been lowered significantly by the amount of water that was globally stored as ice. So while you still had an ice cap here in northern parts of Ireland and in Britain, there was a lot of land area exposed, which nowadays is flooded. And that is an area that giant deer lived in and were able to migrate back into Ireland after 20,000 years ago, giving a very rich population of giant deer about 12 to 13,000 years ago. You'll also see that there's an extensive area of green land between Britain and Scandinavia and the Netherlands, known as Doggerland, and giant deer have been dredged off the floor of the modern North Sea from that area. The map on the left shows the points where caves and some other excavations have been carried out that have resulted in giant deer that are part of our research resource in Ireland. Giant deer are not just an Irish species, however. They may have been most famous in Ireland because it was the first place that they were discovered and described. They occur in large numbers. They occur under peat bogs where people were excavating by hand because they were exporting peat for fuel and using it locally in large amounts. So it was a very important area for giant deer to be dug up and discovered. But the species is known right across Europe and through into Asia and extended across Siberia as far as Lake Baikal on the extreme right. Some of the giant deer in these areas are much older than the ones in Ireland, hundreds of thousands of years old. And some of them also are the youngest known giant deer from 7,500 years ago. Coming back to Ireland, and if you look at the giant deer at the front of our Natural History Museum in Dublin, the one on the right-hand side as you walk in the door, which has appeared on stamps and has been illustrated extensively, was the first skeleton to be fully illustrated and published from a booklet in the 1820s, and it was repeated in the 1830s with this slightly more detailed sketch showing how a giant deer skeleton fitted together from a really good example in Limerick. We know that right at the far end of its range in Siberia, in eastern Russia, an almost identical pattern of bones and skeletons show that we're dealing with the same species. So it is the same species spread over quite a wide area and quite a long time frame. So we have from skeletons a fairly good idea of what the architecture of a giant deer looked like. But we also have done other studies. If you look at the shape of giant deer antlers, the closest shape that you're going to see today is in the modern fallow deer, the type of deer that you'll see in the Phoenix Park and in some other parklands in Ireland where they've been introduced and managed as wild populations. But in order to determine that they were definitely closely related, DNA analysis came into play. And that's been something that's only really been possible in the last 15 to 20 years. And it shows that the ancient extinct giant deer, Megaloceros, its most closest relative today is the fallow deer. That's a genetic link that's now well established. People have studied the antler design and largely measured the antlers to show how outrageous they seem to be. But in the 1980s, the first serious study of combat in giant deer was carried out, and that involved fitting together the antlers of several different giant deer on top of an old warehouse in the National Museum where we had a flat roof, and working out how the animals fitted together if they were going to be in combat positions. And it made an awful lot of sense in terms of what we know about modern deer combat. There are parts of the antler called tines, these projections around the antler that defend the eyes during combat. There's others that are there for stabbing the opponent in the neck as they jostle. But also, because we have such large collections, we can afford to sacrifice some pieces of antler to have them sawn up and analyzed for the engineering strengths in the bone. And these show that the strongest orientation for strength in a giant deer antler is actually in this combat position. So it underscores the logic that giant deer use their antlers for fighting, which is what you would expect with any animal that has antlers and invests so much energy in them. They were also used, of course, for display and are magnificent things that take a great deal of nutrition. An adult male giant deer needs to grow about 40 kilos of solid bone every year in order to grow a full set of antlers, and it doesn't spend an entire 12 months doing that. It happens in a matter of 3 to 4 months, perhaps. To do that, they need really good vegetation. From one example of a giant deer jaw from Doggerland, that area between Britain and continental Europe that was exposed as land during parts of the Ice Age, the pollen grains and other plant fragments have been extracted from a giant deer tooth that show that sage and buttercup were a major part of that individual giant deer's diet. We suspect that giant deer actually had very wide range of foodstuffs and would have included aquatic plants, rich, mineral-rich plants from lakes, but also vegetation, including grasses, but mostly browsing. So eating in areas like this sagebrush steppe, sage plants and buttercup are common in this setting too today, but that's the kind of landscape that you can imagine large herds of giant deer being very successful in maybe 14,000 years ago. If you're growing huge sets of antlers every year, it has enormous nutritional demand, not just on your intake of food, but actually on your skeleton. And if you look at the bottom center slide with lots of little white arrows, each of those arrows points to a place in a giant deer leg bone where the nutrition has sapped the materials from the bones and from the teeth of a giant deer during annual cycles of antler growth. This is very similar to what happens with any pregnant female mammal, is that during pregnancy, not only do they have to eat an awful lot more and be in really good condition, but they will find that the growing calf of a giant deer, in this case, is sapping your energy all the way through and actually reducing the nutrition to your hair and to your bones and to your teeth. So we can see that the same patterns are happening with male giant deer this far back from bones that in this instance are probably something in the region of 12,000 years old. In terms of getting a better idea of what the giant deer looked like, fully fleshed out, we have cave paintings to rely on. And at the center of this cave painting is a little black dot, and that is the hump on the back of a giant deer. There are 3 overlain giant deer, at least, in this image. There's another one on the left with another black hump. And on the right, sort of right of center, there's a giant deer antler sticking up in the air, making it quite clear that the people who were drawing these were drawing giant deer and not other large animals. And that hump and the lines on the coat of the body have been used to reconstruct the coat pattern of the giant deer. So we've come a long way from the first blacksmiths who were asked to assemble a giant deer skeleton a couple of hundred years ago to having a much better idea of how all the different skeletal parts fit together in a slightly more lifelike stance than some of the museum skeletons you'll see. But we also have now a better idea of what they might have looked like fully fleshed out. The collections in our museum are used extensively, not just by scientists to find out more about these animals, but they're also used by a lot of other people, including artists. Here's an important Irish sculptor, Paul Ferreter, working on a model Megaloceros, and the finished product in the bottom right. They're often stylized, they're often artistic. As a scientist, we really want to see the most scientifically correct version, which isn't always what the artist wants. But it does show that the museum collections are used for a lot more than just the science. But in summary, when it comes to understanding the giant deer, we've come an awfully long way, a lot of it through detailed research, using skeletons and bones from museum collections. And that is the point of museum collections. This is why the National Museum has a huge collection of just one species of animal, the giant deer Megaloceros. And it's a shame for natural reasons that these animals became extinct in Ireland thousands of years ago, and that was caused by climate change. But this is exactly what is happening all over the planet today with mammals and with lots of other species. And it would be a sad thing to think of that you'd only ever see them in museums.
Hello and welcome back. Thank you for that fascinating talk, Nigel.
No problem.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed hearing the story of the scientists in the 1980s laying out those massive antlers on a flat roof to work out their combat strategies. That must have been a very fun day at the office.
It was certainly an unusual one. It's been described by other people with us charging around and fighting on the roof of a museum flat roof building. But in fact, we spent most of the time carefully trying to prop the antlers to see if they would fit together and how they would fit together. With a student at the time doing his PhD who now looks after giant deer in the museum in Edinburgh, Andrew Kitchener, trying to see what were the possible angles and therefore did the various projections, the tines on the antlers make sense in terms some are defensive, they protect the face during combat, and others are offensive. They're designed to jab and spike when the antlers are at particular angles when the animals are sort of head wrestling together.
Fantastic. Well, we are getting loads of questions in here. So I think, well, first of all, to say, everybody, thank you for joining us. We've got a great reception today. We've got people from Indonesia, from America, from all over Ireland, and beyond. So thanks for joining, everybody, and thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. We have about at least 10 minutes to fill. So first of all, there is some questions, a lot of questions, no surprise here, about the antlers, Nigel.
Sure.
Do we know what is maybe the biggest set of giant deer antlers that are in our collections, and also maybe the smallest set? Because I know the fallow deer, so if their closest living relative is the fallow deer, and I know the young fallow bucks, the prickets, they usually just have like a single spike when they're that kind of 1 year age or 2 year age. So do we have any examples of small antlers like that belonging to giant deer in the collections?
Well, like any fossil collection, it's an exceedingly biased collection, often because of natural forces. There's reasons, and I could spend a long time going into them, but I won't, why giant deer, large males are so common in museums. It's not too surprising. That's what people want. That's what they pay for. That's what people go looking for. But also they lived in herds like modern deer. This is based to an extent on supposition, but it's backed up by quite a lot of what we know about them in all sorts of strands. So we're talking about a herd animal dominated by a male with a number of females and obviously their own young living in a group, certainly the females and the young. And we don't get very many females at all. So from several hundred giant deer in our collection, we have about 4 females.
Wow.
We only have a couple of juveniles. And the antlers are grown every year. So as you've described, a very young giant deer is going to have a small little stump in its first or second year. It's not going to be very large. The smallest antler I've seen as a complete antler is actually 1 meter long and has all of the geometry of an adult giant deer. So it's probably from an animal that's a good few years old. So we don't have anything younger than that. And as I say, that single antler on one side of the head is 1 meter. Giant deer antlers, you can measure them in lots of different ways, and you can do a very simple crude measurement of what's the biggest barn door you're going to need if you're going to keep giant deer as livestock. And you're going to need a barn door that's about 4 meters wide, because there's plenty of large male giant deer in collections around the world that are in excess of 3.6, 3.7 meters. And many giant deer antlers are not complete. There's also some fake giant deer antlers where people have put several animals together and made giant deer antlers much wider than that. So beware of forgeries and fakes. They're not necessarily deliberately there to con, but often giant deer, like many fossils, are not found complete. So people make them up with spare parts. And that's a bit of a challenge too. But if you're looking for the largest one in our museum collections, it's in excess of 3.6 meters.
Wow.
But you can also measure giant deer antlers by their total volume, which makes a lot of sense if you're trying to work out how much nutrition does a male giant deer need. You could also measure them by weight, but you have to remember that the things that you're weighing have been buried in the ground for maybe 11, 12,000, 13,000 years. Therefore, they're not the way they were when they were fresh antler. So if you're going to buy a reconstructed giant deer, genetically impossible, just as the thylacine that somebody's asking in the question marks, These are advertising campaigns by geneticists. They are not happening anytime soon. But if you need to take in a herd of giant deer, you're going to need barn doors about 4 meters wide.
Excellent. There's a couple of questions coming in about, why is it sometimes called the giant deer, then the Irish elk? Is there a difference? What's the difference?
There's a big difference. Part of it is the English language is a mess, and we use words that other people don't agree with, even people who speak English full time the way that we do in Ireland. Elk scientifically is the same thing as a moose for North Americans. So you're talking about another deer animal, member of the animal family of deer, but in fact it's quite a distant relative of giant deer and fallow deer, and it's very much up the other side of the family tree. That it would be called alces or alces is the scientific name for deer on that side of the family tree. That's why scientists like to use scientific names. But at the time that giant deer antlers were first found, the only other animal in Europe that was familiar with very large antlers that were also very flat was the true elk or moose that nowadays is largely found in Scandinavia and eastern parts of Europe. And they can also grow very large. They tend not to grow as wide as giant deer, but they can grow as easily, as heavily a set of antlers as giant deer. But because people didn't have illustrations, they hadn't traveled the world, Molyneux, when he was writing his first article, assumed that these were the same species. He quite specifically said that because he had a religious reason for saying that, because God doesn't make mistakes, therefore there are no extinct animals. And that was part of his argument. But basically they became famous as Irish elk because it was a different type of elk-like deer. And the specimens in museums around the world, an awful lot of those have actually come from Ireland, even though it is found in other countries. Ireland has a lot of really nice contexts for paleontologists and other people to dig up giant deer and sell them around the world.
Very good. Okay, so some other questions are, does any of the collections of the giant deer have any signs of butcher marks or engravings? And do we have any other evidence of what may have predated on Megaloceros?
No, is the simple answer. We don't have any giant deer bones in our collection that show signs of butchery or marks made by humans. Those are rare in many contexts anyway. It doesn't mean that it never happened. If you are drawing cave paintings in the south of France tens of thousands of years ago, quite likely people were eating giant deer because they were in the landscape at the same time. We do have some very unusual giant deer bones that from the 1860s, it was noticed they had rub marks. And literally that was parts of the other parts of the skeleton rubbing against the antlers in waterlogged sediment. As the water levels went up and down, the bones were actually moving in the bog and actually rubbing against each other, leaving nice, shiny, polished areas that people speculated might have been human intervention, but seemed to be just movement of bones adjacent to each other. In Ireland, the main arrival of people is about 10,000 years ago in what we call the Holocene, the period we live in today, that's quite habitable throughout most of the northern latitudes of Europe. There was a very cold period before that that lasted maybe 500 years, which is a lot of different names in different countries, but it's the Younger Dryas period or the Woodgrange interstadial in Ireland. And those were periods when it was exceedingly cold and there wasn't the vegetation for either the males to grow their antlers or for the females to raise their calves and grow calves. They didn't have the nutrition, so they died out locally here for natural causes before the main populations of people got this far west in Europe.
Very good, Jay. So you just answered the question there that Rachel Ann Murphy had down. So another one here is a specific kind of one. So by Hugh, are the antler sizes unique? There are some found in County Armagh in 1814, and the dimensions were well documented. So he's wondering, could he use these dimensions to track them down? No better person to ask.
Quite possibly, Hugh. I have a database of over 600 occurrences of Irish giant deer. Some of them are very vague, and others are quite specific as to where exactly was it, was any information collected. Frequently there isn't. And in some cases, I was actually able to help people who had a giant deer antler set and had no idea where it came from. And I was able to pin it down exactly where it had come from almost a century earlier, because there was enough overlapping information. So you can email any general inquiries to naturalhistory@museum.ie, and that'll reach the curators, who can answer them or direct them to somebody who knows the answer.
Fantastic. Then there was a question here as well. What is the evidence for saying they were, I suppose, common rather than numerically common rather than frequently preserved?
There isn't, is the simple answer. Giant deer fossils are extremely common. They're in quite high densities in sometimes small areas, and they were only in Ireland for a couple of thousand years in those particular settings. So it does suggest that in some places there are significant accumulations, but you can get that by just a handful of animals dying every year if they're all dying in the same place. So it's a very hard question to answer. We'd like a bit of time travel in paleontology and go and watch these things in the wild. We have to look at the patterns of other large deer and the way that they behave and see what parallels we can make. And there's an element of educated guesswork. But as scientists, what we try to do is say, how do we get beyond educated guesswork and nail it down specifically? And in some cases in paleontology, you can do that. But in others, it's not really an easy thing to do at all.
Yeah. Again, there's some more talk about this, the extinction of the thylacine. So you said that there hasn't been any mention of this for the giant deer.
Well, Twitter is a genius in waiting out there that keeps telling us about amazing things that are happening. If you want to know what's happening in Australia, buy a book by Jack Ashby called Platypus Matters, and you find out that in Australia, animals are going extinct a lot faster than geneticists are selling newspapers. And if you really want to put your effort into doing something constructive for wildlife, it can be a huge distraction to suggest that we're going to have woolly mammoths and thylacines back anytime soon. Many animals have gone extinct for very good reasons, and many of them are humans' fault. Others are natural environment collapse or change with time, and that's a major issue for things like giant deer and woolly mammoth. The places are not there to put them back.
Yeah.
The landscape since thylacines disappeared almost a century ago have changed significantly in the areas of Australia and Tasmania where they were found. And any animal that competes with agriculture or human interests is still on its heading to extinction if it's not very lucky. So we could probably spend our time much more effectively than worrying about whether genetically it's possible to get something back that looks like a thylacine using some thylacine ingredients. I don't waste a lot of time with that,
Yes.
sorry.
That's all right. I think that is actually a good place to end because we have run out of time. But just to say, and I think Megafauna Forever has put it very nicely, thank you so much, Nigel, for this presentation and for your valuable scientific advice over the years. We all really appreciate it.
Well, it's out there and there's a lot of publications. So if people have very specific questions, don't be afraid to follow them up. We may have answers, or you may help us to get to the answer.
Exactly, exactly. Well, just a few things to say before we wrap up, and that is thanks to you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this Heritage Week event. There is so much happening across the different museum sites this week, so be sure to check museum.ie for more information on our Heritage Week events. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Museum of Ireland and Natural History has reopened on the ground floor only. Booking is required, so you please book your free ticket by visiting the museum's website. Also, if you would like to help us bring the Dead Zoo to life, please consider leaving a donation on our website. For more information, please see the donation link that will be in the chat soon. And something that we really value in the education department is your feedback. So if you have time, please fill out the online feedback form that's being sent to you via Eventbrite now, or you can always contact us on our email, which is educationnh@museum.ie. And finally, before we go, just a last massive thank you to Nigel. It was a fascinating talk, and also I just want to say thank you for all your support throughout the years. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to your next talk.
Great. No, I hope you all enjoyed it this afternoon, and keep tuning in. There's a lot of similar things on our YouTube channel to follow through.
Absolutely. And guys, thanks. So many people are posting thank yous here. So thanks a million. And that's all for now, folks. I hope you have a lovely rest of your Friday afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.